Hello and welcome to episode 14 of the Nostalgia Bubble podcast, the show where two lifelong best friends celebrate the movies that they love. I'm your host Shuggy, an amateur film reviewer and nerd.
I'm Nye, Shuggy's personal stylist.
Yeah, you did tell me to get an Among Us jumper, and I did.
Yep.
And we're kicking off season 2 with a bang. We have our first ever guest on the show, one of our dearest friends, Ronni.
Hi.
Yes, hello. We've spoken about Ronni a couple of times.
She's never
in
seen
season
Star Wars.
1.
Yeah, I think I'm already a fan favourite.
So it goes without saying that this pick is not Star Wars. This was your pick, wasn't it, Ronni?
Yeah, absolutely. Thought I'd lean into the expectations of me and go for a classic Wes Anderson.
Our second
Lovely.
Wes Anderson on the podcast.
Yeah.
So yeah, we're doing Moonrise Kingdom. I was about 85% sure you'd pick this, and there was about 15% of me that thought you might pick My Neighbor Totoro.
Yeah, that was definitely one of the ones that I was considering.
Shug, I think you're a lot more familiar with Ronnie's film taste than I am.
Yeah.
I imagine it's a conversation you've had more regularly than me.
Yeah, we're Wes Anderson nerds.
So I was actually really interested to watch this because the only Wes Anderson film I'd seen before we recorded season 1 was Grand Budapest Hotel, and then obviously we spoke about Rushmore last season. So I was quite intrigued to kind of see. I think this was the first time that I got an opportunity to kind of really see the running themes through each of Wes Anderson's films and how kind of clearly stylized they are. So thank you very much for this pick. I really enjoyed it.
Great, nice. I should start getting commission on how many people I tell to watch it.
Yeah, you start getting royalties.
So what did sort of inspire you to pick this?
Partly, as I say, the expectation that you would have of me to do so. I think also it's such a simple film. Like, you try and tell somebody what happens in it, and there's really very little that you can tell. But I just think it's so charming, and I think I've chatted to you, Shugs, before about how I just think it so beautifully encapsulates like that age and how strong you feel about things, and how I personally hated the idea that at any point I'd be patronised or sort of treated as though I was a kid anymore. And I think that this film does such an amazing job of like just completely validating that experience, even though these kids are kids.
Oh, that's really interesting, yeah.
Yeah, just kind of building on that and almost going back to my first point is that like this is something that I've seen across all three of the Wes Anderson films that I've seen, is this idea that I think I described Rushmore as being kind of if a kid were to play out, so you know how you used to kind of do sort of like role play as a kid, and you'd kind of be like, right, now I'm going to go and do this, and you'll do that, and that was like your game, that was just how it worked, and you had this very specific image in your head of what you were meant to be doing and how you were meant to be acting. And I think that is Rushmore was very much like the kind of dramatization of a kid's imagination of adulthood, and I think that this has exactly the same sort of undertones. Obviously there is an element of a kid kind of, or two children specifically, sort of trying to live way beyond their years, and I just think that, I don't know what it is, but that seems to be like a running theme throughout Wes Anderson films.
Oh, for sure. The amount of like children who act like they're in their 50s in Wes Anderson films is wild. Because Grand Budapest Hotel, Zero in that, he's another one.
Yeah, absolutely. Just at no point does it like say, oh, you're just a child, you'll feel differently in the future. People offering to marry this couple of like 12-year-olds, and as you say in Grand Budapest, like Zero, I've forgotten the name of his wife, but them getting married, and there's all sorts of moments where people could just say, absolutely not, this is ridiculous, you're a child, and instead actually people just constantly just go along with it because they recognise the strength of those feelings.
Yeah, it's like the extent to which the adults interact with that kind of behaviour. And like we were saying in Rushmore, for example, you've got like the relationship between Max and I can't remember her name.
The teacher.
Yeah, the teacher, and it's all just a bit weird. Like she seems to kind of I don't really know how to explain it, but she lets it all happen. She accommodates those feelings, and she entertains them, and she entertains his fantasies to some extent, and the exact same happens in this film. But what I find really interesting here, which I guess in Rushmore you kind of get between the sort of the Max and Bill Murray's character, is that there are also all the adults in the film also have an element of acting like children, and it kind of like questions where the line is, where the kind of reality and surrealism of it all is drawn, because like even the things like the kind of scouts like base is like a full-on army training camp.
I love the Scouts base so much. It's my favourite bit in the film is when Ed Norton's Scoutmaster is just inspecting all these more and more ridiculous things. You know, the treehouse that's just on a single, very tall, thin bit of wood.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, it's just like, it just calls into question like whose imagination is being sort of depicted here, and where, like, is it kind of the Scoutmaster Ward? Is it his imagination and him trying to be a kid, or is it sort of the young kids trying to act as adults? Is it Sam trying to be an adult? And it's just a really interesting dynamic which is kind of played around with.
That's such a good point, and I think there's something there as well, isn't there, in that moment that they ask the Scoutmaster what his real job is, and he says, "Oh, I'm a maths teacher." And then he goes off and he comes back and says, "Scratch that. I'm a Scoutmaster, and on the side I'm a maths teacher." And it is that, like, I'm an adult. No, wait, scratch that. I'm the kid with a side of adult.
Yeah, that's like such a classic Wes Anderson bit, it's such a funny line. Like, it's hilarious, but it says something, and it really gets to the root of the character.
Yeah, I just think it's brilliantly written to kind of show those two kind of contrasting approaches and almost sort of merge them together.
Yeah. Before we kind of go any further, I will do a little bit of pre-production. Feel free to hop in if you have any comments, Ronni. So the main idea that Wes Anderson had of sort of a romance between children kind of came from his memories of back when he was in like 5th grade, which I had to Google is about year 6 equivalent. But, you know, when nothing would actually ever happen, but he would like dream about it. And this is almost like what that kind of dream would be. So that really speaks to what you were saying, Nye, about kind of playing out those fantasies. But he also took a lot of inspiration from when his parents were separating when he was 12. So that's why you've got a lot of the stuff with Susie's family and kind of the falling apart of that marriage. He worked on the screenplay for about a year, but only managed about 15 pages. So he had to turn to Roman Coppola, who is Francis Ford Coppola's son, and Jason Schwartzman's cousin. Also Nick Cage's cousin, but that's completely unrelated to the film.
And Sofia Coppola's brother.
You just had to give Nick Cage a shout out.
I just had to give Nick Cage a shout out.
Couldn't go without.
Yeah, we're about to, at the time of recording this, which I'll tell you when this comes out, he's about to release a documentary on the history of swear words, and I'm so excited.
Oh my god. Do you know what? I dread the day that you suggest the Nick Cage film.
It'll happen one time. Anyway, Roman Coppola had kind of worked with him on Darjeeling Limited, so he brought him in to help, and yeah, that ended up kind of getting through. The mid-60s setting of the film, Anderson said it was chosen completely at random, but it really fit in the end with what he was doing with the Scouts. He wanted initially to have a bigger budget, but after Fantastic Mr. Fox actually kind of underperformed, they had to rein in the budget a bit. And now we have to get into the casting, because they spent 8 months auditioning kids at different schools. Now this is kind of reminiscent to what we had with Rushmore and the attempts to find Max. Again, they were kind of worried that it might not happen if they couldn't find the right people. Jared Gilman, who plays Sam, they said he was just immediately hilarious, and they had to cast him. Cara Hayward, they said that she just managed to, when she read the script, managed to just make it feel so natural. So she had actually seen the Royal Tenenbaums. It sounds like her parents were even more lax than yours, Nye. And she really took inspiration from Margot in that. Obviously, the film has Bill Murray and Jason Schwartzman as like regulars that are always in Wes Anderson films. Jason Schwartzman said he didn't even like need to really read it. He just said, "Yeah, I'll take whatever part you're offering me because I know you have picked the right part for me." But this also introduced Ed Norton, Frances McDormand, and Tilda Swinton, who have all gone on to become regular collaborators with him. This was actually the first Wes Anderson film to have no involvement from Owen Wilson at all, which, he'd been in every single one, at least in a small role. The last kind of things were like small parts of the film that really just give weight to the world. The 6 books that Susie has, he commissioned art for each one of them and wrote kind of the passages in them. And there is out there sort of animated promotional material for each of those books.
I didn't know that.
Which,
That's so fun.
they released that. Nor did I till I was sort of researching this, and I will definitely forget when it comes to putting the podcast out, but maybe, just maybe, I'll remember to put a link in. He also spent a lot of time making the maps for New Penzance and St. Jack Wood Island. He said it was something that he thought would be really simple, but actually to make it feel real, it took a lot of attention. I'm sure, Ronnie, you're another Lord of the Rings nerd, so I'm sure you love and geek out about movie maps as much. Like, they are really cool, like the way he kind of planned out the islands and the way they use it in the film is awesome. And that's kind of all I've got on the pre-production.
So we'll get into the film then.
Yeah, I mean, just from the first shots in Susie's house, this just feels so Wes Anderson.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the way everything is framed, the production design of the sets, the way everything's kind of very symmetrical, the way the camera just kind of pans along, and it just, everything just lines up so perfectly. It's just so Wes Anderson.
And I think, actually, so I took some notes, having heard that Shugs took notes, so I wasn't the only nerd here.
Yes, fire away.
Well, so I haven't got so many because I got too involved in actually just watching the film again. But
It's okay, I took
first, the first one I wrote was Doll's House effect of moving between the rooms, and I do think it's like such an interesting way of doing it. It's all sort of, you have that sense of when you open the doors of a dollhouse and it's all just laid out for one very specific viewpoint.
Yeah.
And I do think that's so interesting, like this whole like toy element tying into what we've already chatted about like childhood. And I didn't actually realise that the 60s setting was random, really, but it kind of fits with the whole sense of like my parents talking about their childhood. Yeah, so I found that like that doll's house thing really interesting. Just from a sense of like Susie also feeling really trapped in it and expected to be a very specific kind of person and a very specific kind of daughter, and then her sort of breaking out of that enclosed doll's house style space. Yeah,
the doll's house thing always really, comes through to me as soon as they have any kind of outside shots of houses. It's the same in kind of Grand Budapest Hotel. It's like, you can't tell whether it's like a model or it's an actual house that is built. It always kind of is in a weird, hazy in-between. Are those places real, or is it just something that they've, a miniature that they've built? And I love what you said about kind of it tying into Susie's life. Because, obviously this is, a film that was built around kind of a romance between these two kids. But I think the kind of deeper layer to it is they really connect because, for both of them, they're really struggling in their family lives. We find out that Sam's an orphan who doesn't really fit in with his foster family. And Susie, obviously, she discovers the book, dealing with a very problem child, which apparently was something based on Wes Anderson's actual life.
Of course.
Which is not very surprising, given, like we said, Rushmore is very much, Max is Wes Anderson brought to life. And, you can see there's always elements of that in his work.
I think he's got some issues.
Don't all great filmmakers, and that's why they make art,
Also, have you seen him? Like, that's not a boy who grew up, boy next door style.
I already kind of mentioned how much I love the Camp Ivanhoe Scouts and just the ridiculous stuff that's going on. But I want to talk about Edward Norton in the film, because for me this is my favourite Ed Norton performance of all time.
Yeah.
I think he's very well known as being incredibly difficult to work with. But in this film he comes across like so compassionate and sweet, and the fact that he comes back to other Wes Anderson films meant they clearly clicked, and he actually feels comfortable working with Wes.
Yeah, having seen him in limited number of films, it's all been very. I mean, I've seen him in American History X, Fight Club, and The Hulk, and obviously knowing his history on the set of The Hulk, and this he clearly takes himself incredibly seriously. It was actually quite nice to see him do something where he was like a little more personable, and sort of brought some real genuine kind of relaxed humour. And it just kind of added a whole different element to his performance, which was kind of just refreshing, really.
I mean, the scene where he sits with Sam in the boat after they've kind of found Sam and Susie on the beach.
Yeah.
That for me is that's my favourite scene in the film. I think it's just he's so kind of compassionate but slightly awkward.
Yeah.
Like he's trying to say the right thing, but all he knows about is the Scouts.
Yeah.
Really.
I mean, for me, this was actually when you got to see the teacher come out of him. He was trying so hard to be this sort of big kid the whole time, and actually it was when he needed to sort of be compassionate and almost display things that you kind of pick up from life experience more than just naturally having these traits and these abilities, this sort of emotional awareness. It was when it was in that particular scene.
Yeah, definitely. It's a gorgeous scene, isn't it? And I think the difference as well of him having that conversation with Sam, and then the conversation that Susie's having with her parents, where they're being like, "You'll never see each other again. Those are your last words to one another," and just the contrast of that, of the different ways that adults are trying to respond to the children. Yeah. I think you're right. It's just that compassion is really lovely.
Yeah, and I think also there's very much a contrast between the two, where Susie's parents seem to have completely kind of lost their sort of inner children. And her mum particularly is sort of trying to find that excitement again. Obviously, she's got a little something going on with Captain Sharp, with Bruce Willis's character.
Yeah.
And so you can see her trying to find that. Bill Murray's character has completely given up. And
so somehow he's more depressing than Bill Murray's character in Rushmore.
I thought that. Yeah, and then you see Scoutmaster Ward. And he's somebody who's very much still in touch with his kind of inner child, and he's the one that is compassionate. So, and that's why I felt like there was kind of that sort of happy medium that was shown there, where it's like the life experience of an adult, but the kind of compassion of a child, or just the passion of a child.
Mm.
I'm also so glad he gets kind of that hero moment at the end where he saves all the Scouts.
Yeah, because he is so useless through the whole film.
Yeah. Like when the entire Scout troop goes missing, and he sits down to breakfast, and it takes him like 5 seconds.
And I just going back to his checks on the Scouts in the morning. I loved the Shawshank.
Yeah.
The Shawshank reference. Yeah, I just thought that was you could see it coming a mile off.
100%.
But I was just like, it's fantastic.
It's so unnecessary as well, because you can just zip the tent back up and go. It's not going to help him in any way.
Also, when did Shawshank come out?
94.
So the film took place before the Shawshank Redemption came out, which is like a nice little detail. The fact that obviously this would not have in the world of the film would not have been a reference to Shawshank.
So what do you guys think of Captain Sharp? Because normally I am not a fan of Bruce Willis kind of post the year 2000, but this is kind of one of the few films where he always seems pretty apathetic in performances, but it kind of works here, that it works with kind of Wes Anderson's style, that he's almost a bit non-emotional.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I think the whole thing is so underplayed, right? And I think that's maybe where I will put my hands up and say, as you might expect, I've not seen many Bruce Willis films. but I think like maybe that's that's where he comes in to his own, in that he's like relatively quiet and quite thoughtful. So much is not said in Wes Anderson, and maybe that's where he like really that sounds like such a like passag or way of saying that he's a rubbish actor or something. When you're not speaking, it's really good, but more that yeah.
That's the hardest bit.
Yeah, I think that's it. I think maybe it's so understated. I definitely find myself struggling to separate actor from character. So I really like his character, so I really like him. But I know you had some really interesting things to say about the separation of the two. Was it the episode 9 with of Sixth Sense?
Sixth Sense, yeah.
Yeah, and I really I learned a lot from that episode. Big fan over here.
Yes.
Hey.
But I obviously
That's
haven't.
why we got you on.
Obviously haven't learnt enough, because I just think like Captain Sharp is great and so wonderful that he like steps up and steps into that void where like Sam doesn't have parents. And they're two men or boys looking for family, right?
Yeah.
And there's parallels between them, so I think that they're a great fit. But I don't know that necessarily says anything particularly interesting or insightful about Bruce Willis himself.
No, it's fine. I think the scene he has with Sam where, he talks about the person he loves not loving him back, it's genuinely sad. And I think the fact that there is kind of a thought that Bruce Willis gave up trying kind of after he got really big off Die Hard, and then really gave up trying after he stopped doing Die Hard rip-offs. And that kind of works for, this guy who has been beaten down by life and has kind of given up until he kind of almost finds this new lease of life in Sam. This is almost the kid he was.
Yeah. I think there's also, I mean, Ronnie, you're also right to say that they come from almost the same place, like, and Shug kind of pulling up the point about this sort of unrequited love. And like, even Sam is in that position with his foster family, and they like, I think he's literally on a very literal basis sees himself in Sam, in that respect as well. Shug, you can definitely talk to Bruce Willis films more than I can. You've definitely seen more than I have, but I think Wes Anderson seems to ask quite a sort of deadpan performance from actors. There was the scene where Captain Sharp and Mrs. Bishop, Frances McDormand's character, where she ends it with him, and he kind of just gets up and walks away, and then she does the same with kind of not much sort of visible emotion on the surface. And at that point, I actually struggled to tell whether that was Bruce Willis being Bruce Willis by Shug standards, and whether he actually proved Shug right, or whether he was just very accurately sort of depicting and sort of portraying what Wes Anderson tends to go for. But in that scene, especially bouncing off somebody like Frances McDormand, and especially with such stylized acting, I thought it worked brilliantly. And there's that moment on the church roof as well, on the spire, and you do see, I think you see a bit of compassion from him, and you see something that's kind of quite emotive. So yeah, I thought I was a fan of him in this film, actually.
Yeah, I think this is kind of the perfect film for Bruce Willis. Kind of, at this point in his career, it's the kind of film where what he does most of the time works, and he is willing to put in that extra little bit at the end. Wes Anderson gets that out of actors, and I agree that the scene at the end on the spire, it is a moving one. Like, he is compassionate, and it's all done also very, very strangely. Like, you kind of get what they're going with, but they hold it back and talk in code and all this.
Yeah.
Legalese from the bishops.
Oh, I just love that they call each other counsellor.
Yeah.
So good.
I love that Tilda Swinton is called social services as well.
Right.
Yeah,
she
Yeah, and
doesn't have a
refers to
character
herself
name.
in third person
Yeah,
the whole time.
fantastic. Yeah, she's another person who, obviously she was in Grand Budapest as well. So she's obviously clicked with Wes Anderson to some extent. I find her very interesting as an actor. She is quite deadpan anyway, and maybe it's also her casting, but she fits the role very well. It's not a huge role, but she kind of slips straight into that role.
Oh yeah, his cast are always stacked. I think actually she is, her character in this is very different from her character in Grand Budapest Hotel, where she's very over the top and terrified of dying. In this she's far more reserved, and she is essentially representing an entire governmental body.
Mate, well, I guess also in that respect, I mean, this kind of idea that social services are kind of unforgiving and systematic with everything. You can't, I mean, if you're going to pack their persona into a nutshell, then it's going to be that, right?
Yeah. Okay, and then it sort of takes 15 minutes into the film before we even get to meet Sam. There's a lot of hubbub about him disappearing long before we ever get to see him. We finally do. He shows up wearing this fur hat, smoking a little pipe. He's just that perfect level of Wes Anderson. Kind of dweeby, but kind of cool.
Isn't that what the whole Scout camp is?
Yeah, you're right. Apart from the one kind of antagonist character, Redford, is actually cool, leather jacket, driving a mini motorbike. He doesn't get the redemption arc because he's actually cool. There's none of that in a Wes Anderson film.
I love the reaction of the other boys and how they're so disappointed when they're told that they're not allowed to use force and they have to bring him back unharmed. And then they're saying, I don't want to be the only one who's unarmed when we do find him. And then cut to them having a homemade weapon with nails sticking out of the wooden bat and stuff. It's so funny to me.
Yeah. Which you find ridiculous, and then one of them ends up getting stabbed.
And Snoopy gets shot.
Yeah.
Oh, that is one of my favourite lines. Was he a good dog? Who's to say? But he didn't deserve to die.
Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. I wrote that down as well.
As soon as a dog gets harmed in a film, I'm no longer a fan.
I mean, this has to go down as one of the funniest dog deaths in movies. I rewatched Screen Junkies Honest Trailers did a whole all the Wes Anderson films, and one thing they said is it makes you kind of happy, kind of sad, and kind of unsure if you're meant to be laughing at stuff. And that the dead dog is the perfect summary of that last part.
Yeah.
Where it is funny the way it's portrayed, but it's hard to say whether you should be laughing.
Also, why was the dog there in the first place? What was it meant to be doing? Obviously, helping them,
sniffing him out,
tracking them down. But the fact that a dog got caught in the crossfire, somebody had terrible aim.
Yeah.
I guess actually that scene is another example of when things are left unsaid, in that it cuts to just the motorbike in the tree and Susie saying maybe they're right, maybe I do go berserk or something.
Yeah.
I think that's really clever. You don't need to see it. It's that purposeful omission is just really clever. I think that's just something that he does with such expertise throughout, just what isn't shown, what isn't said.
Yeah.
Also, it kind of takes away from your expectations, because you've heard from the Scout kids how Sam's, the one with behavioural issues, and he's the one who's facing him down. And then you cut away, and then when it cuts back, it's Susie's the one who stabbed him in the back as he's tried to attack Sam.
I mean, we've spoken a lot before about how kind of withholding information can sort of really play into the hands of creating sort of whatever it is that you want to create, whether it's tension, whether it's humour, and in this case, obviously, it's humour, because it sounds really extreme. What I love about that is that you're obviously sat listening to it, and it sounds really extreme, and then it cuts to the shot of the motorbike, and it's suddenly even more extreme somehow and more absurd than you thought it was.
I still don't know how that motorbike got in that tree, because they weren't on the edge of a cliff. And we kind of get to the old Chickasaw Migration Trail Inlet, or some other confusing name, which becomes to be known as Moonrise Kingdom. And this stuff is all so sweet and awkward at the same time. And there's someone, like, it's the most Wes Anderson thing you can imagine. There's two kids with a portable record player dancing to French songs on the beach in their underwear.
It's very French.
It suddenly feels like this is the kind of the first time in the film for me personally where, so like obviously I've spoken about how it feels like kids trying to be adults, and at this point in the film feels really like it's actually supposed to be an adult in the scene. And I feel as though this is kind of almost the crossover or the point where you start believing that actually these two kids are or should be portrayed as adults. And
even, they get a little Titanic reference in there when he's painting her.
Yeah.
And and they're doing sort of all very adult things. But this is also
which
where
also came out after the film was set.
Yeah, I mean most films did.
But now, if we're doing that, then actually Titanic was pre-60s.
Well, not
so
not
if
the
we're counting
Titanic
when things
film.
were set.
Not the Titanic film though, because it was a reference to the painting, which is solely in the Titanic film.
Wait, you mean the Titanic film isn't a documentary?
What?
Huh?
Honestly, I did a show of Titanic a few years ago, and people were in the foyer asking where Jack and Rose were. Yeah.
Oh my god!
Oh no!
It was abysmal. But yes, I love the reference to Titanic, and it just adds to the surrealism of Wes Anderson.
Oh, I'm so glad you said that word, because I have this whole thesis, which is like, it's not really a thesis, it's not clever enough to, but basically, I'm a big fan of magical realism in fiction. So Gabriel García Márquez is one of my favourite authors, and I just see so much of that in Wes Anderson's films. Like, things just a bit weird happening, maybe not supernatural in Wes Anderson, but very strange things just being treated as completely normal. Like the motorbike in the tree, all sorts. And then, I mean, this might be getting too technical, but in terms of like time jumping back and forward, the narrator saying that the storm's coming in 3 days, etc.
There's never too technical.
And the point at which the narrator's the one who tells everyone where to find Sam and Susie.
Right? Yeah, absolutely. That narrator, like, moving in and out of the narrative.
Yeah. And just wondering what the position of the narrator is, like, and where that fourth wall is.
I've literally got breaking the fourth wall as my third note.
Great minds, right?
And it's so weird because then later he's, on St. I keep wanting to say St. John. It's St. Jack's Wood Island. Which I'll tell you why I keep wanting to say St. John's Wood Island. It's because there's a Rolling Stone song which references St. John's Wood, which is used in another Wes Anderson film.
Okay, I was waiting to see how you're going to link that back.
Yeah, full circle there.
Yeah, exactly. Nice. But he's standing on there, tracking the storm when all the scout kids with Sam and Susie arrive on St. Jack's Wood Island. So he rats them out earlier, but at that point he's just not involved.
Yeah. And what's really interesting as well is that, like, usually it's the fourth wall being broken is more about kind of making the audience or the watchers feel as though they're stepping into your world. So they're breaking through and coming into your world. What I found really interesting, there was one point where he plays with the light on the camera and then walks off, and the film continues, and that almost makes you start to think about the world on the other side of the camera in a different way. And it's just a really kind of, it's a really small way and like a really subtle way of just sort of almost subverting the idea of breaking the fourth wall, and it makes you feel like you're doing it rather than them, which I just found, or that's how I felt about it anyway. But yeah, I just thought that was kind of a really interesting sort of change of tactic.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, that's a great spot. I didn't even notice that.
Well, thank you guys.
I also feel like this might be a prime time to like shout out my dad if he'd ever listened to this, because how frequently he looks like the narrator, because he's got this red coat and he wears a hat that he never wears like quite low enough, so it has a little like flappy bit at the top too. And I always just tell him he looks like the narrator in this film. So
there seems to be a correlation with people getting shout outs on this podcast and them ending up on the podcast. So
oh no.
So look out for
season 3.
Your dad in
come.
season 3. I also really love the moment where the scouts kind of all decide that they have not been acting well, and they all. It's got a very funny bit continuing with the treehouse where he slams down on the kind of window and it just falls out, just to really emphasise how unsafe it is. But also it's a really nice moment where they kind of all realise that they have not been nice people, and just because someone's different doesn't mean that they should shun them and go and help. And they launch these 2 escape plans.
Yeah, it's lovely.
Yeah, I think Anderson does these moments really well. I know that Shug, you kind of at the end of the last season, for most heartfelt moment, awarded the Bubble Award to almost the same moment in Rushmore.
Yeah.
And what Anderson does really well with these moments is he manages to emphasise the kind of personal growth in that moment, rather than it just being kind of like a turning point of the film. He's really good at sort of bringing each individual character under question and kind of then sort of redirecting them, and sort of shaping their character arc in those moments. And yeah, I just found that this I sort of responded to that moment in a similar way to how I responded to that kind of that sort of same situation in Rushmore as well.
Yeah, and I think Moonrise Kingdom has quite a lot of those kind of little moments. We talked about the Ed Norton on the boat one as well, and Sharp and Sam, discussing Sharp's history, stuff like that. I think there's a lot of them in this, and they're really good.
I think also, Susie, when she's surrounded by all the scouts and she's reading the book, and I think that's development, right? Because she goes, it feels like the books and her reading all those books before they run away is part of her like antisocial, not wanting to interact with the world around her so much, and then she takes that step and is reading to Sam and is really quite caring for him when he's fallen asleep with the pipe in his mouth, and she gets rid of it and then carries on reading. And then by the end she's there reading to all of these boys. Actually my girlfriend was saying that she felt it's quite a like Wendy in the Lost Boys moment.
Yeah, I can see that.
And I think that's such an interesting arc that she goes through, that she sort of has learned to socialise a bit better, trust, and like share herself and her passions with the people around her.
Yeah, that's a really lovely point.
Yeah.
Also, that was kind of, they talked about animating, they put all those little animated parts of the books into the film when she's reading, but decided not to, and have those moments where you can see everyone gripped by the stories that she's telling them. And I think that works really well because of exactly what you said about her growth.
Yeah, I almost cried as well when she popped over to look down the chimney at Sam when they brought her with them. Yeah, that for me was like that was a heartstrings moment.
Oh, you're a big softie now.
I am. Total
marshmallow. You're on a podcast with 2 well-known criers at films right now. me and Ronni cry a lot.
Crier at adverts,
me too.
mate.
Me too. I got it from my mum.
I've been there.
My mum cries at Chicken Little. That's not an exaggeration.
Everyone cries at... Oh no, at Chicken Little. I thought you said Chicken Run for a second there.
Oh no, everyone cries at Chicken Run.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say, and then I realised you said Chicken Little. Also in this escape plan is we go and meet Cousin Ben, who's Jason Schwartzman, who I know you're a big fan of, Ronni.
Yeah.
I love kind of the cooler Jason Schwartzman that we see in Rushmore, where it's, very much Wes Anderson put himself in a film.
There was certainly a Top Gun vibe here, if not an actual Top Gun reference.
You know what? I didn't even think about it, but there is big Top Gun vibe here.
Absolutely. I really like the kind of the sort of juxtaposition of him sort of trying to really portray this. I would say Top Gun. That was what jumped to mind. This kind of like ultra macho American hero type, and then he ultimately what he's doing is he's buying into this. It's not a game, but this kind of fantasy that these kids are living out, especially when he's marrying the two, like.
Even more, his plan is to send them to live on a shrimper and work on a shrimper, and just no one questions it. Like it's just like that's the most normal thing in the world.
But I mean, that's the great thing about Wes Anderson films is that like nobody questions things in the film and nobody questions things outside of the world of the film. Like it is what it is.
And the $76 or the nickels that he's going to keep as his fee, but they decide to give it to him because they're worried about their future. It's just delightful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I also love when he gets them to, go and have the talk and make sure they're sure. The withholding conversations like that is not a new thing in films. Like you go classic like On the Waterfront, and there are key conversations where you don't hear what is said, but the decision to, instead of music or something, to just put over a kid bouncing on a trampoline. Yeah. It's so funny. It so just like undercuts the moment in the funniest way possible.
And also this kind of idea that like, I mean, once you get to this point in the camp, they've got like a false church. They have people doing zip wiring, and it's kind of like, it's like Go Ape, but a lot more militant. And then randomly there's a trampoline there which bears no relevance to anything.
Yeah, I mean, for Lebanon is really Camp Ivanhoe on steroids. Like, it's taken to a whole nother level.
So again, it's the absurdity of it all, and just this, it's almost like an arrogance that Anderson has to just know that he can just throw something completely random and nonsensical in a frame, let alone in a story, and people just won't question it.
I mean, there aren't many other directors who could get away with it.
No, absolutely not.
Can you imagine the read-through, though? Like, the actors there being like, okay, I'm doing this, and in the background there's someone trampolining.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have to have an imagination, right?
Like, it's even commented on, like, Jason Schwartzman's character tells them, go have the conversation by that trampoline.
Yeah. I also like the fact, just kind of going back to Cousin Ben's payment, and like the way that the other kids kind of want to take into account Susie and Sam's future. Yeah. And it's almost like there's just things that they take into consideration that a kid ordinarily wouldn't. So things like the idea that, oh yeah, then we get married, and then we need to think about our financial security in the future.
Yeah.
Like it's
and,
just
that $76 will keep them in financial security. But it's what you're saying. But there's also the not quite understanding it.
Yeah.
Like the $76 is not going to get them financial security.
Yeah.
It's all they know. That kind of moment sums up the two words I most associate with Wes Anderson films, which is charming and quirky.
Yeah.
Yeah. It is all about charm. I mean, it's half of the reason the kids in his films get away with everything that they do.
Yeah, exactly. And we kind of talked about the big finale at the church. I do like that it's, it all takes place at the church where Sam and Susie originally meet in the flashback.
Yeah.
Like, you're not sure where that is until this end point. I think that's a nice kind of, full circle to that arc. And I like, Sharp's the first one to spot the kids in there, but he doesn't tell social services or anyone. You can already see he's on their side at that point. It shows his growth.
It briefly went to a very dark place of let's jump off the roof together. And pushed it right to the edge with want of a better phrase. And there was a moment where I was like, oh my god, is this where this film's going to go at this point? But
also the really deadpan way they're like, they're discussing if it's he's not a good swimmer, and he's talked about that in the film. And then the really deadpan way they bring up, if it's not deep enough, we're just going to die crashing into the ground anyway.
Yeah.
It's again that kind of, this is really dark, but the way that it's done is quite funny. And it's that, are you meant to be laughing or not?
Yeah. And that just kind of the lack of thinking it through.
Yeah.
Like, there was no long term to this plan. And it just almost kind of like boils it right down to the fact that they are two kids, and they don't need to look any further than the landing.
I think you brought up the word now of logic. I think that really struck me when you said the word logic, because I think in real world quote marks logic, like, none of this film makes sense. But like, when I think of world building, I think of Lord of the Rings, Shugs. Like, I think of probably people think of Star Wars if they've seen it. But as you say, like, with the maps and everything, like, he is a world builder, but it's in a different way to the one that he hasn't written all these languages of elves and God knows what else.
It feels like he's building the world from the perspective of a kid.
Yeah.
Whereas you could look at something like Lord of the Rings, and as much as children admire that and love it, it's not done by a child. I mean, that is a world built by a linguistics professor.
Yeah,
and you can tell that.
Yeah.
When you compare it to something like Wes Anderson, and the fact that Wes Anderson speaks so much about how it's all so much of it has come directly from his childhood, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But it feels, and it captures that so wonderfully that's why you don't question it.
And I think, like, there is internal logic, right? There is logic within this film, and therefore, like, their act at the or the act that they're proposing to take at the end makes sense in their logic, because
I think that's the important thing. As long as the internal logic of the film works, it's fine. It doesn't have to play by real world logic.
Yeah, and at no point, I mean, the only time that their affection for one another is called into question is when Mr. Bishop picks up the tent and doesn't throw it, which is one of my favourite parts of the film. He just holds it and then it's like, just puts it down. But he says you don't love each other. But actually, at no point did I question whether they did or not.
Yeah.
And it's you buy into seeing this from the perspective of the kids, and seeing the grandeur, and like, who didn't want to, when Edward Norton's character opened the tent, who didn't want to spend a night in there? Like, I was like, that looks really cozy.
Mate, I want to be in the treehouse.
Yeah, like, it's all built to, although it's stupid and it doesn't make sense in this kind of adult world, it's like, it's built from the perspective of a kid, and you're genuinely enticed by it all, and you want to experience what they're experiencing.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason people talk about Wes Anderson essentially being his own genre of films. It is these films that there isn't actually any fantasy to them, like, in an official, genre sense, but they are fantastical.
Yeah, that's such a good distinction. And doesn't it say more about Mr. Bishop that he tells them that they don't love each other, when actually, like, it's him who has no imagination, no link to his inner child. He and his wife don't seem to love each other anymore. Like, that seems to be so much more a statement and judgment on his own life than on their experiences.
He seems to be in a sort of similar position to Captain Sharp, but Captain Sharp, accepts what is happening more and buys into it and embraces it, whereas Mr. Bishop doesn't, and that's he seems the far more distant, and that is kind of the slight tragedy of Susie's life, is that she's lumbered with this cold family that don't get on.
Yeah, well, you also, as we said earlier, like, there's this kind of parallel that you can draw between Captain Sharp and Sam, whereas Mr. Bishop doesn't seem to have that person that reflects his position or his character, and like we said, he's the one that seems to have lost his inner child, and it's almost like those who have kind of lost sight of all of that are the people that aren't going to be able to connect to what is shown in this film, and not necessarily being a comment on the audience, but the people within the world of the film. Like, it's those people that can't understand what's going on, are the people that don't have that connection and they can't relate to it.
Yeah.
I remember, like, my sister and I used to fight all the time, and when we started getting on, it was when I could finally start relating to the things that she did and said and the way that she acted, because I could remember being that age. And so that's when we started clicking, because I was like, oh my god, I know why you're being annoying. Trying not to say anything worse than that. But it's that kind of, he lost his view and he lost his insight on that, and yeah, you're right, it's a comment on his problem, not on Sam and Susie.
He does have the best line in the whole film, in my opinion, though, which is when he calls the scouts these beige lunatics.
Yes.
I'll quickly do a little bit of post-production before we get kind of final thoughts on the film. So it premiered as the opening film of the 2012 Cannes Film Festival. It was Anderson's first ever film to screen there. It did compete for the, it was in competition for the Palme d'Or. It didn't win. It did win. I can't remember the name of it, but there is like a cat award for a film that has a cat in it. It did win that.
That kitten was so cute.
Right?
It was very
the
cute.
most cute.
So it was cuter than the dog, and you will never ever catch me saying that again.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. I'm a dog person, but I'm here for the cat in that film. Also, how it's in every single room in that opening shot. It's in every single one. I love it.
Amazing. And I'm definitely here for all these dog people joining the cat army for one episode. So it actually opened in cinemas in France on the same day, and then opened in the US a little later. When it opened in the US, so there is a tactic where films open in a small amount of theatres. So it opened in 4, and it set the per theatre average gross record, which is the most money per divided, the amount of money divided by the amount of cinemas. And it went on. It was Wes Anderson's highest grossing film in North America. I don't know if that's since been beaten by Grand Budapest Hotel. It received really strong kind of reviews from critics, 94% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes, and an average score of 8.24 out of 10. It got Oscar nominations and BAFTA nominations for its screenplay, and it was up for Best Musical or Comedy at the Golden Globes, and a ton of awards at the Independent Spirit. There was a couple of controversies. Some people thought that the kind of depiction of sexual awakening of the two main characters was a bit much for children, but actually a lot of people kind of said no, it was delicate and largely inoffensive.
We did kind of gloss over that scene a little bit. It is a bit weird, I think.
Yeah, it is a little.
Having studied French films, it feels very French in how open they are to doing that. Like, I feel like all of those complaints will have come from North America and none from France.
Yeah,
I imagine so.
But it is a weird scene.
I mean, it's uncomfortable, but I think the exploration of sex as a kid is, however natural it may be, I think it is quite uncomfortable, and it's a learning curve for everyone. So
I think that's the thing, like, it's uncomfortable as a viewer to watch it. It doesn't necessarily feel uncomfortable for them to be doing it, but it's uncomfortable for me to see 2 purported 12-year-olds doing that.
Yeah. But that is also part of Wes Anderson's films. Nothing makes sense. Nothing is meant to feel okay. It's all meant to be a bit weird and off the mark. But I mean, it's similar
to Max, heavily crushing on his teacher and her kind of reciprocating in Rushmore.
Yeah.
The other controversy, which you definitely did touch on, is there was some backlash on Twitter and a whole New Yorker article about whether Wes Anderson hates dogs, which is something he surely put to bed now. He made a whole movie celebrating dogs called Isle of Dogs, or which can be pronounced as I Love Dogs.
Yeah, which I still haven't seen, and I really should.
I think it's a solid film. It's not one of his best, but it has some stunning sequences.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
Does anyone have any kind of final thoughts on the film?
Thank you, Ronni, for suggesting it. I really enjoyed watching it, and it's nice. It's really nice to have no clue what to expect, because Shug and I have obviously been doing this for a season, and we kind of I know what films Shug likes, and I haven't spoken to you as much about it. So yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed
Oh,
it.
you're so welcome. I thought actually when I was rewatching it, I thought that there's definitely a sense of like, I mean, we didn't go into this. I won't go into it too much now, but just in terms of like Sam as the sort of creative spirit and like a sort of softer soul in comparison to the more potentially like stereotypical macho other scouts. And he's very in tune with his like creative side, his like he's interested in literature, etc. And I did think like there's a level that I imagine that you would enjoy that as somebody who is very, very creative and like involved in the creative arts.
He's
Thank
never
you.
created a thing in his life. Definitely not a podcast.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean that kind of went over my head, but maybe that was why I enjoyed it. Intrinsically, that was it.
I think that is a really lovely point. That it's definitely
Well, I think
true.
it says a lot about a young boy's perception of masculinity, and I mean the fact that he is the least kind of stereotypically macho lad there, and as is so often mentioned, the least favourite scout. And
Well, also the only scout that doesn't get redemption is Redford. You know, the one who, says who's the one who's says they're all going to bring weapons. Who wants to bring him in with force.
Yeah, absolutely. And I thought when she was reading the book to him and the rest of the scouts, I thought that was kind of a really nice image of like there on the periphery, and he's the one that has kind of found his place with this person who he says he loves, and like I just thought in terms of exploring what it means to be a young boy, I thought it's kind of a really sweet message.
And they fell in love through writing. Sorry, the literature student in me is like, I just love that.
I really actually love that scene where we kind of go through their pen pal history, and it starts off, it's really sweet, and then it just gets more and more into their issues and their familial issues, and I think that's a really kind of one of the actually most sad scenes in the film, but also it's got this overtone of celebration because it's connecting these two people.
Yeah.
Thanks again for suggesting it. I was fairly certain it's what you were going to pick, because we have talked about Wes Anderson many a time, and I know this is your favourite of his films. It's probably somewhere in the middle for me. My top three are Grand Budapest Hotel, Rushmore, and Fantastic Mr. Fox, but this is definitely up there after those.
I'd say my top three are Grand Budapest, Rushmore, and this one.
Well, those are the three you've seen.
Yeah. But I'm sure I'll see more over the course of recording.
Yeah, we'll be like the Criterion Collection and eventually do every Wes Anderson film.
Yeah, probably.
Oh, well, thank you for the opportunity to nerd out about it.
Oh, no worries. It was lovely to have you on. First guest.
Yeah.
And I think, Shug, it's going to be your pick for the next episode.
It is.
So, Ronni, you're here to hear.
Well, I am picking what is, in my mind, the greatest action-adventure film of all time, and the only real competition is its sequel. I'm picking Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Oh, love it.
Yeah,
I
this
love
is gonna be
the
cool.
Indiana Jones films. I recently bought them on DVD.
Yep,
And
I was there.
I cannot wait.
Yeah, no,
Yes.
I love both Raiders of the Lost Ark and Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. I think they're both incredible.
Yes. Do you know what? I think this is the most excited I've been to see one of your picks. Honestly,
Excellent.
cannot wait.
I'm looking forward to it.
Amazing.
And as a kind of closer this week, so the way we kind of became really close friends with Ronni was at Reading Festival, which is one of the kind of major music festivals in the UK. And also one of the things that, initially me and Ronni kind of bonded over back when we were in history class together was the fact that you'd heard of my favourite band in the world, We Were Promised Jetpacks. I thought this would be a good time to kind of talk about our favourite musical artists.
All right. I was going to say, when you said we were promised jetpacks, I was like, I'm going to sign off now.
So yeah, this We Were Promised Jetpacks is my favourite band of all time. They're a kind of Scottish alternative rock band. Released 4 albums. The first album for me is my favourite album of all time. It's a work of genius. Go check them out. I don't actually know your guys' favourite artists, if you have one. Which is obviously such a hard question, and probably changes for most people all the time.
Ronnie, I'm going to guess MCR. No?
Oh, well, if you want long-term, like, love of my life, solid relationship, yeah, it's going to be My Chemical Romance, because, you know, I'm a 90s kid. Yeah, I'm meant to be seeing them. Well, I was meant to see them in June last year. The real tragedy of COVID was that it got postponed for a year. So I'm fingers crossed the vaccine's all sorted by June this year.
Well, hopefully.
They might have even written some new music for it.
Oh, mate, can you imagine? They've just released a makeup line. Don't get me started on that. I'm not here for it. Anyway. I'd say, it really depends for me what mood I'm in. If I want to dance around, it's Halsey. She's always like my Spotify top artist.
You're right. You've spoken to me about how much you love Halsey before.
I haven't heard her music, so I'm going to go away and listen.
Oh, you absolutely will have. You'll have heard Closer by Halsey and the Chainsmokers.
Oh, yeah. Okay,
yeah, I mean, it's no way her best, but it's her.
That's very different to MCR.
Listen to her other stuff. It is very different, but, like, the same people. She grew up listening to My Chem, so there's a sort of direct line.
Okay.
Or Bear's Den, which is a very different vibe.
That's kind of chill folk.
Yeah.
Indie. Yeah, I dig that. That's laid back.
Yeah.
That's the one of yours that I dig.
Okay. My favourite artist, just based on whose music I love most consistently from like song to song, is an artist called Bruno Major. I actually only found out about him a couple of years ago. It was when I was doing a show in London, and a friend had him playing in the changing room, and I was just wondering what it was. And 3 months later, I went to see him live, and it was the most kind of relaxed, chilled vibe sort of live performance I've ever been to. And it was just he does kind of alternative pop rock. It's all very relaxed, very light, nothing too strenuous to listen to, very sort of simplistic in its melodies, and I love the kind of pretty simple in his lyrics as well, but just sort of really honest, I think, in a way. His music is very interesting. A lot of it is quite kind of it's quite systematically done. It's quite, you kind of understand how he sort of structures his songs, but you can tell he's a brilliant musician, and having seen him live as well, he released an album in 2020 mid first lockdown, which kind of kept me going, and there's not one song that he's released which I don't like, and also I've got to give special props to Eminem just for artistry. I just think he's the best rapper there has ever been. His lyricism is incredible, and I will never not like him as an artist. Even if he comes out with songs that I'm not necessarily a fan of, I can't deny how good he is at what he does.
So there you go. For a closer, there's some different ideas for some music you can go listen to. And you can find the podcast on iTunes, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Podbean, YouTube. Maybe we'll have got Spotify working at this point, I don't know. You can follow us at Nostalgia Bubble on Twitter and at Nostalgia Bubble Podcast on Facebook and Instagram. You can follow me at Shuggy Says, that's SHUGGIE Says, on all social media platforms.
You can follow me on Twitter at Nyerees, so NYEREES, and on Instagram at ReeseNye, and Ronnie.
if you have any plugs you want to give.
No, none.
Stumped.
That's fine. And we will see you next time to talk indie.
Yes. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.